We on? Yes, it sounds like we're on. Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming to this panel on energy policy issues. We have labeled it Boom or Doom for the following few reasons. I am very taken, often with my mouth hanging open, at all the increasing information I receive about the historic upsurge in access to what people use phrases like vast stores of oil and gas reserves in this country. Declining for about the last 40 years, starting in the 70s. In the last few years, we have a graph that goes like this for about 40 years. Now we have one that goes like this. A remarkable development that I think is increasingly recognized in major or indicated in major media, but I don't think fully registered. At the same time, and I just might add, there's just wonderful comments and so-called factoids about this, but for the first time in 62 years, the U.S. was a net exporter of petroleum product, as to be distinguished from oil, crude oil and gas, but products, fuels, distillate. And a number of analysts predict that between the next 5 and 7 years, if oil and gas production at the rates it is increasing now continues and is allowed to continue by the government, that the U.S. could be, before 2020, the largest producer of oil and gas in the world, such that the long drawn-out issue of energy independence, championed by last six presidents without any success, is sort of an effortless byproduct of the private sector's activity and not any state or federal energy policies. At the same time, I observe this is going on. We also have, to quote a comment that now President Obama made as a candidate, that he would end the tyranny of fossil fuels in our generation as our parents ended the tyranny of Hitler. There are various policies we all know about, reluctance to even make a decision about the Keystone Pipeline. We have great issues and questions about potentially endangered lizard in West Texas, and many of the EPA rules, current rules, or pending or adopted or possibly proposed in the near future, could put some brakes, if not something even more dramatic. Some states, Governor Christie, sometime early this week, signed a year moratorium on hydraulic fracturing. Moratorium. So, boom or doom? We're fortunate to have, in my opinion, some extraordinary experts on this issue with us today from different perspectives. And I'm going to make some very brief comments about their resumes, if you will, but not very long, because all these people you could go into great detail and be very, very impressed, but I'm going to allow time for them to speak. We'll first hear from Lane Sloan. Lane had an almost 30-year career with Shell Oil, including positions as Vice President of Corporate Planning, Chief Financial Officer, and President of Shell Chemical Company. I think he's worked all over the world for Shell in those capacities. He's co-chairman of the Greater Houston Partnership's Energy Collaborative Committee, president of Sloan Consulting Service, and a Silver Fox advisor. He was previously a professor at the University of Houston's Bauer College of Business, and he co-authored a book with Chris Ross entitled Terra Incognita, a navigation aid for energy leaders. After Sloan, we're going to hear from Cyrus Reed, who's Conservation Director for the Lone Star, the Texas chapter of the Sierra Club. He's worked on Texas environmental policy issues since 1994, originally with the Texas Center for Policy Studies, and is a co-author of the Texas Environmental Almanac. He has a doctorate in geography from UT, and before becoming the Texas Sierra Club's conservation director, he worked with our legislature as a lobbyist in the last 2 legislative sessions. After Cyrus, we're going to hear from Roger Bedzek, who has come from Washington, D.C. to speak with us today. A remarkable, highly senior world national energy economist, a lifetime of extraordinary work. And his most recent book, published last year, was the impending world energy disaster. And finally, we will have William Perry Pendley, who is president and chief legal officer of Mountain States Legal Foundation in Colorado. Perry also has an extraordinary career on key committees in the U.S. Congress, senior positions in energy at the Department of Interior, and has for many years fought many significant battles on resource use and private property rights, particularly in the western states, but of impact to across the country. I welcome all these experts, differing perspectives, perhaps somewhat different subject matter, but all, I think, really important comments to hear about this historic moment we have of the promise of tremendous boom in the production of U.S. natural resources, yet with policies circling around that actually could decline to take advantage of that opportunity. So please, Lane, we welcome your comments.
Listen, I very much appreciate the opportunity to discuss energy policy in this great state of Texas, who happens to be the #1 producer. What did I just do? Happens to be the #1 producer in energy in the whole nation. Kathleen had mentioned that one of the things I did was an executive professor at the University of Houston, and there I used to teach strategy and leadership and energy courses. And when I taught my strategy course, one of the things that I would tell the class is you really have to emphasize your strengths. Texas's great strength is energy. You just look at how far have we gone here? Just look at this chart right here, you can see that we're #1 in crude oil production, we're #1 in natural gas production, we're actually #1 in wind production, and we're #1 in electricity production. So we've got a lot of strengths to work off of, and the one thing that I would tell the Texas legislature guides that might be in here is really try to work on that strength, maintain that strength. And that will be very, very helpful for your constituencies. Now, the question of boom or doom, if you look at this chart right here, and this is information from Susan Combs, who's our state controller, you can see from her statistics that clearly we're in a boom, because everybody knows we've been through a great recession, but nevertheless, in the oil and gas extraction area, we've actually had an increase in jobs from 2006 to 2010. Likewise, you can see that service companies have had a 9% increase, 9,000 jobs, pipelines another 2,000 jobs, and this doesn't even include contractors. Now you might say, well, what's the contribution of particularly the oil and gas side, who has had a very significant contribution over these many years for the state? But in 2010, and this is Texoga information that you can see here, the contribution, and this includes royalties and taxes, all forms of contribution from the oil and gas industry, is $7.4 billion. And that's a pretty good size number, isn't it? And if you look at the severance taxes, $1.7 billion. Now, of course, the severance taxes provide for the rainy day fund. A quarter of that goes to the rainy day fund. And so $451 million of that 1.7 went into the rainy day fund. So a real key question for legislators is, what are you going to do with that rainy day fund? And my strong recommendation is, not unlike previous legislatures, be prudently conservative. Now, when you think a little bit about that, one of the reasons that I would say be a little conservative is to think about what might happen with prices. Everybody knows that oil and gas is a commodity, and prices can go up and they can go down. If we look at this next chart here, you can see a very long-term play of crude prices. Now, crude prices today are about $100 per barrel. And the southwest part of our state, in particular, the Eagle Ford shale play has had a very robust economic generation going on as a result of shale oil. And the rest of our state has been doing pretty well as well. The Permian Basin has had a terrific go, and East Texas also has been pretty well, and it's driven by the fact that you've got $100 oil, which is a very big price incentive. On the other hand, when you have a price incentive, and I can just tell you, being 30 years in the energy industry, guess what people do? They invest. And investments are occurring all over the world today. And what are those investments going to do? Increase supply. So if you've got increased supply, then what you worry a little bit about is demand. And of course, today we look like we're probably coming out of this recession, but it could go the other direction. And if it does go the other direction, and where the big demand is coming from these days is China. So if China falters a little bit and their demand goes down, what you could actually see is a rather precipitous drop in the price of crude oil. So with that, I'd say, be just a little bit careful. And as mentioned, I was the vice president of corporate planning. I can't take any accolades for predicting the price of crude. We didn't do that well. And the reason we didn't do that well is there's a lot of dynamics that go on. So if you just think a little bit about natural gas, 10 years ago, everybody thought this continuing decline curve, it was just going to continue. We were having terminals built, LNG terminals, so that we could import gas into this country. Guess what? Shale gas has turned that around entirely. And the place where shale gas was discovered was here in the Barnett. So Texas is the one who's gotten shale gas off the dime. But we're now in an interesting position where we actually have a glut in supply. I mean, this is an incredible, situation, a total turnaround. And we're thinking about exporting natural gas these days. And I can tell you, it wasn't that many years ago that the price of natural gas was about $13, per MCF. Today, it's $3 per MCF. And when I was with Shell, and this is over several decades ago, we used to talk about a, natural gas price bubble. We may be in that natural gas price bubble again. So I'm just saying a little caution there never hurts. But if you say, well, what does the long-term outlook look like? It's pretty darn bullish. And it's pretty good for Texas. With 7 billion people in the world today, there's about 80% of those people that are in developing or undeveloped countries. And guess what they're interested in? Increasing their standard of living, just like what we've got. And so that's going to put a lot of pressure on energy demand. And in fact, the forecasts are that energy demand will probably go up 30 or 40% by 2040. So we've had, here we are with crude oil at $100 a barrel. That's pretty, bullish for what crude might look like down the road. And it's obviously a good sign also for natural gas. Now, one of the things that I did mention was that, or was talked a little bit about, that I'm the co-chair of the Greater Houston Partnership's Energy Collaborative. And one of the things the partnership has done is it's put together a balanced energy policy resolution. Now, why would you do that? If you see that, there's a 30% or 40% demand that's coming around, we're going to need all the energy we can get. And so with that, a balanced energy policy, we believe, makes a lot of sense. And here is that balanced energy policy. Now, the interesting thing about this particular policy is it's balanced. And one of the things that we do with it, as you probably know, the Greater Houston Partnership is a chamber of commerce. It does some lobbying, and we try to lobby in Washington, D.C., because we really don't see the balance happening there in Washington, D.C. Now, why is it that Houston even talks about energy? What gets us excited about energy? Well, half of Houston's economy is based on energy. And in fact, if you look at the top 20 oil and gas U.S. companies in this country, 10 of them have their head office in Houston. So it's pretty darn important to Houston. But it's not just Houston. If you take a look at Dallas and the Fort Worth area, there's been a significant economic impact from the Barnett Shale. If you look at San Antonio, there's been a pretty significant impact there from the Eagle Ford. If you're out in West Texas, the Permian Basin, Odessa or Midland, a big impact there. So the point I'm really wanting to make here is that it's one thing to say $7.4 billion is going into the coffers of the state and local government. There's a lot more happening, at the local level. So don't forget that. It's half of Houston's economy. So that's why we speak out about it. Now on this chart, you'll also see balanced environmental objectives with economic growth and job creation. So I want to talk just a little bit about that. Not that slide yet. But if you start to think about Houston and its situation, I would have to say that we've had a rather significant issue with air quality. And if you look back and you say, well, what caused that kind of ozone effect? We've got a great big manufacturing and refining capacity. We also got a huge transport system. But Houston has really stepped up. We've got 60 different monitoring sites. That's more than any other city in the country. And on those sites, if you take and say, well, what's been the improvement? There's been a pretty remarkable improvement. For example, the 1 hour daily maximum ozone concentration level has decreased 44% from 1987 through 2010. Well, if you think about policy and the Clean Air Act in the 1970s and the Clean Water, both those were really needed at that point in time. I mean, we were not in balance, and so there was something we need to do about it. However, as I look today, I begin to wonder, has the balance shifted too far in the other direction? I think this is a real serious issue to think about. Everyone that I talk to in the industry says there's an onslaught of regulations that have been coming. I also was mentioned earlier, you talked a little bit about this dunes sagebrush lizard. Many in the industry have concerns because if it goes under the Endangered Species Act, some in the Permian Basin are saying, we may be endangered category for oil and gas development. Whether that becomes true or not becomes something that has to be worked out. But I can tell you for sure there are certainly some concerns and suspicion that the Endangered Species Act is being used as kind of a ploy or a vehicle to really reduce oil and gas and even wind development here in Texas. There'll be a lot of folks that would disagree with that. I'm just telling you that's an impression that sits out there. There's something like 95 or 96 potential endangered species that might have to be dealt with here in the short term. And Susan Combs has kind of spoken out. We don't know how we're going to deal with all this. So there's an onslaught that's been coming. Now, as far as this sand dune lizard, hopefully that will be dealt with. There's a kind of a 6-month period here to see if we can get that worked out. Jerry Patterson has clearly had some interest in it. And I don't want to make these things too inflammatory, but he calls this thing reptile dysfunction, just to give you an idea. So, now, beyond that, though, water is clearly in the limelight. It is the biggest challenge, in my opinion, in this upcoming biennial. I think that HB 3328, which is the hydraulic fracking disclosure law, really didn't address a lot of the important issues around the chemicals that are used in hydraulic fracturing. I think most of you, is there anybody here that's not aware of what hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling is all about? But, okay, well, the whole issue is that if you take a look at the opportunity of shale is not very porous. But there's a lot of oil and gas potential in shale. And historically, people knew the potential was there. We never had the technology to get it out of the ground. And so in fact, hydraulic fracturing has been used. The first hydraulic fracturing was done in 1940. So when you hear people worrying a little bit about hydraulic fracturing, it's been around for a long time. What's unique about what happens with shale gas, anybody heard of George Mitchell? George was the guy who got this all off the ground in the Barnett Shale. But what happens is you go down, you drill, you find, if you will, this shale layer, and you go horizontally. We can actually turn the pipe horizontally. And then you end up breaking up the rock by putting in a lot of water and sand and some chemicals that pressures, if you will, and fractures the rock. And so there's multiple stages in doing this as this thing is kind of across the board, and it's actually made what was unproductive oil and gas very productive. So we're in a very interesting situation because that uses a fair amount of water when you do this hydraulic fracturing. And the real issue today, when you got a drought on your hands, is what are you going to do? There's a lot of competition for that. So it's not just the issue around chemicals; it's who uses the water, and that is going to be one of the biggest issues I think that the legislatures are going to have to deal with in this upcoming biennial. Well, look, one more point I want to make in terms of the environmental side. I just have to say, on the federal front, my warning to the state legislatures is, whatever authority you have today, do whatever you can to keep it. Make this a priority that you retain your rights to be able to determine what happens in Texas. Because I can tell you right now, the EPA is really outreaching beyond what I feel, is reasonable. And I'm not the only one who's kind of feeling that way. And the problem is federal mandates don't always fit local situations. So that's the thing to really think through and be very proactive in keeping these states' rights. Well, in conclusion, what I want to really tell you is this is a great time for the Lone Star State to shine. Here we are with all this potential for 30 to 40% energy growth, and we're the #1 energy producer here in this country. And this is going to be happening for several decades. This is not a one-decade event. Shale, in particular, for both oil and gas, may very well be the silver bullet. Most of the time when you talk about energy policy and portfolio and all that, people talk about you need silver buckshot. Well, it's very possible that shale could be a silver bullet. So Texas is very well positioned. This is really a 21st century energy source now. And the only thing that I would ask as the state thinks about what the policy is, make it balanced, make it reasonable. So when you talk with the voter out there, whether it's the Jane or the Joe that happens to be in the Panhandle or in a big city in Houston, it makes sense to them. Thanks very much.
And now we'll hear from Cyrus Reed.
So it's an honor to be here. One thing I appreciate about TPPF is in their forums, policy discussions, they often invite people who may have a different view. And so I may have a slightly different view than other speakers. I'm here representing Sierra Club. I'm the conservation director of the Texas chapter of the Sierra Club. I'm not going to talk about federal policy. I'm here to talk about Texas and the Texas electric market. My perspective is, I may have gotten the title right. Did we say boom or doom? I said boom or gloom. I think it's both in Texas electricity market. So there's a lot of exciting things happening in our electricity market and a lot of good steps we can make policy-wise. But there's also some gloom or doom or however you want to say it. I have a tendency in my PowerPoints to put way too many words in so no one can actually read them, so they're really for me. But let me just make a few points as we go forward in this discussion of the electricity market. One is Texas kind of has a complicated electricity market, as many of you know, because we have some utilities that are fully integrated and have essentially monopolies, either within or within the ERCOT electrical grid or outside the grid. And we have others that are disaggregated, where the wires company, the generators, and the retail providers are all separate. And so it does make it difficult for policymakers to deal with electricity as a whole in Texas because we have these very different markets within Texas. In most cases, our deregulated market, the one that's competitive, kind of means that it's up to the market what types of generation get built and where, right? It's really a market decision. And with our new nodal market, where we've gone down to the node, we've gone down to the nitty-gritty on how we price and dispatch our electricity, it really means that it's really up to the market how that electricity gets dispatched. So theoretically, that could be seen as a good thing because markets work, prices go down, the most efficient generation sources get deployed where they need to, where the load is, where people need to use that electricity. So that's good. The problem is, and this is sort of the gloom part, what about when, as apparently we might have now, we have scarcity problems and the pricing isn't there to build new generation? What happens then? Or what about, as we've seen with the present drought, with our present climate, where there may be issues with our climate and our weather just in having sufficient water to run those power generation sources, or whether you believe it's the bad EPA putting regulations that are overstepping their boundary that could limit generation, or, this would be more the Sierra Club perspective, these are needed regulatory fixes to fix problems with air quality. Those too can impact that electricity market and make it harder for us to meet those generation needs. So I'm going to be talking about those things. So some boom. So wind has been a success story in Texas. And people may agree or disagree with the policy, but the legislature did set a policy that we're going to have a mandate in Texas that you meet a certain amount of your electricity from renewable sources. So whether or not you agreed with that policy, the good news is we're kind of past there now. We've met those minimum requirements, and the wind has been competing, and the studies tell us overall it's lowered our wholesale prices, right? So whether or not you agreed with the policy to create a mandate, we've met those mandates and we've gone beyond them, and now people are actively investing in wind. So the market is now working for wind. There's new coastal wind that's come up as well, and some of the issues with wind has been, is it being produced at the time you need it, because the wind blows in West Texas more in the spring and mainly at night when you probably need it less. But the new coastal wind resources that are being developed actually have a better profile. So we have a new source of energy, coastal wind, and maybe into the future off-coast wind that should help us meet our needs. And that's good. We have this wide open market, and we're incorporating these new technologies. The new natural gas finds. It's been important that there has been a lot of generation built that's combined cycle, very efficient natural gas plants. Sierra Club has sort of a, what do you call it when you're not sure how you feel about something? We don't have a discordant policy, I'd say, but we have things we like about natural gas and things that we're concerned about. But overall, we know that combined cycle natural gas plants are cheap, are pretty clean, and they're helping us meet our load. The energy efficiency programs that we require of the wires company, they've been able to meet those goals fairly easily at low cost. So we've been able to, within our market, create energy efficiency programs that are working. So those are some of the good news. Some gloom, there really are some electrical system stresses. So both the February 2011 events that I know the legislature held a lot of hearings about, and these more recent August events after the legislature ended, showed that we do have some problems meeting, even with this market system of meeting some of our loads. We did have some programs in place to meet those emergencies, so we didn't have, a blackout or major brownouts back in February. We had some programs to meet those needs. But there is the real issue of, do we have enough generation for next summer? And whether or not Casper went through, even with the stay, we're still seeing ERCOT and PUC spend a lot of time on new rules because they're concerned we're not going to have enough generation. And really what it gets down to are the prices there, because our prices are fairly low these last few years, are there the prices in place to incent the generators of electricity to actually want to invest in the Texas market and generate that electricity? If they don't see long-term, the price isn't there, it's going to be difficult for them to do it. So that's sort of some gloom. Solar, Sierra Club sees solar long-term as an important investment, and Texas could be a real player in it. But other than Austin Energy and a big announcement by CPS Energy, which, again, have their monopolies, so it's easier for them to spread those costs long-term, it's really not happening in the competitive market yet. One thing we may want to work out, and we worked with several people here in this room last session, weren't able to get it done, is what's the policy in Texas if you do on-site solar, if you put your solar on your roof and you put energy back into the market, at what price are you going to get paid? And we don't really have a statewide policy on that, and that may be one thing where we can incent on-site. And again, on-site solar is growing in Texas, but it usually is with subsidies. So when are we actually going to have it be a real part of the market without subsidies, which would be the long-term goal? Some gloom. We talked about reasonable environmental regulations, and again, whether or not, whatever you think about the most recent EPA regulations, we do have air quality issues in Texas, and it could be that reducing emissions from those large, older power plants, mainly coal plants, are going to be the cheapest way to meet, along with vehicle standards, but are going to be some of the cheapest ways to meet that. Because frankly, the refineries along the coast in the Houston area have already made those huge cuts in their emissions. And it's the big source that's out there are the older coal plants. So that's going to be an issue. But when you do that, as we've seen in the analysis, that does impact our generation resources. So that's I guess it's a gloom in the sense, can we have those rules, can we have clean air and also meet our generation resources? We say yes, but there are obviously people who are very concerned about those rules. Water needs. The drought has been bad, and the climatologists tell us those hot periods are going to continue for many years. And so when you have energy resources, like the big coal plants, like, frankly, nuclear plants, like some of the gas plants, although the combined cycles are more efficient, it means you may have trouble either having sufficient water to run those, or it could impact downstream because once the water goes through the cooling process, it's hotter, and you may have environmental regulations which prevent you from discharging all that water. And the drought exacerbates those issues. So in our mind, these drought conditions mean, as a state, we should be looking at things like energy efficiency, demand response, dry cool era technologies opposing to using water for natural gas plants, and some of the renewables because those are waterproof. They don't use as much water. With all these EPA regulations, utilities are faced with, is it better to retrofit, add expensive pollution control, or ultimately retire? And I think in Texas, we're going to have to face that issue with a lot of our older legacy plants. And it's just kind of a fact. Whether the EP regulations go in this year or 5 years from now, we're still going to be faced with those issues. Shale gas, there's a lot of it out there. So it's a boom. But there's I'll call it, there's a dark side to it, right? So in the Barnett Shale, this has produced a lot of wealth, a lot of jobs, and the shale gas has increased the availability of gas. So that could be a good thing. But there are air emissions issues with, not necessarily with the fracking itself, but with all the compressors and the engines. There are real emissions there, and it does impact ozone levels and can impact things like benzene locally. And those are issues we need to deal with. Whether the EPA does it or we do it, we need to deal with those issues. And it's going to be particularly important for, I think, as we go forward, perhaps the technology is going to improve. There's going to be cleaner production. But what do we do with the 14,000 wells and all the associated facilities that are there now? Could there be a use of programs like Texas Emission Reduction Plan to use some of that money to clean up some of those older units? That could be a thing we need to deal with. Eagle Ford, it's, again, jobs, wealth, more resources. But it is an area along the Carrizo-Wilcox where we have limited water availability, and each fracking job, depending on where you are and what technology you use, it's 3 to 8 million gallons of water. Overall, mining in Texas, very small percentage overall of our water use. But in certain localities, west of Fort Worth, Barnett Shell, Eagle Ford, it's going to be higher than 0.5% or 1%, particularly as we move forward. So the implementation of the hydrofracking disclosure is going to help us track some of that water use, but I think we're still going to need at the next legislative session to improve at least information reporting about the water that's used for oil and gas industry. And maybe I'll mention this, we may need to put some limits on that water use, or at least encourage people to use water reuse and other technologies. There's some other issues with natural gas, saltwater disposal and pipeline regulation, some of the oil field fluids and waste disposal issues that I think we need to deal with. Because if this is going to be a big part of our energy resources, and I think it will be, we have to deal with some of the gloomy side, which is air emissions and water use, and we should deal with it. Sierra Club's not saying in Texas we should shut down, fracking, but we should regulate it appropriately. So what are some of the opportunities, and I'll kind of wrap up here, the opportunities for a cleaner, waterproof energy future? One is we can implement stuff that you guys already passed, right? So we passed energy efficiency, rules for the energy efficiency programs, transitioning to a peak demand goal, allowing more varied and direct energy efficiency programs that our utilities run. So we can do that. Part of that bill, SB 1125, was ERCOT, you need to adopt rules to allow, I'll call them, there's megawatts and then there's, what's the term, negawatts? In other words, you can produce power or you can turn power off at certain peak times. And we do our industrial facilities along the Gulf do it all the time. They say, pay me and I'll turn and I'll run my production at a different time of the day because you're having trouble meeting demand. Well, we're starting through ERCOT the process for how do we allow that to happen for small commercial facilities or even retail customers. So they could actually use our market and bid into it and turn down power when we need it as opposed to new generators. So that's something we could be doing. We passed some more bills on the rules for demand-side renewables like on-site solar, energy storage, and we just had today the last day to make comments on another what energy storage facilities have to pay the generator to get the energy before they release it. The point I'm trying to make is these new technologies, demand response, energy storage, on-site renewables, if we get the market rules right, could be a huge potential and help us meet our energy needs because we have this experimentative market. So I think what we need to do as a legislature is get the appropriate environmental regs in place for the shell and open up our market to these other new technologies because I think they have the advantage of they're not going to have air quality problems or water issues. And so that would be without getting into the whole discussion about the EPA regulations, that's what I think we could be doing as a state to prepare us better, whatever those EPA regulations are. I think I had one. This is just more me saying I like these things. Let me add one more thing, which is, again, whether you like it or not, we're spending a heck of a lot of money on those CREZ lines to get that West Texas wind. So if we can do things to prioritize co-location of resources, so if we can prioritize that natural gas, energy storage, solar, and wind, use those same lines that we're already all paying for, let's do that as well. So those would be my comments. Thanks.
Now we'll hear from Dr. Bedzek.
Good afternoon. I want to run through a number of slides here quickly, just stopping on a couple that I feel that are key. And we talk basically about electricity market in Texas and specifically that role of coal plays in it, and then get into oil production, liquid fuels, and the role for unconventional fuel production. What's holding us back is a whole series of problems, many of which have already been mentioned. today. At present, coal produces over 1/3 of electricity generation in Texas. However, it's not generally recognized that coal consumption for electrical power generation in Texas is the highest of any state in the nation. In fact, it's more than twice as high as any other states, such as Indiana, Illinois, or Ohio. So coal is a major player in the state of Texas. It's also by far the least expensive way of generating electricity. There it is compared with natural gas. It's still a lot cheaper and a lot less volatile. The levelized cost of electricity generation, basically what it costs you to generate electricity from coal, is many times cheaper than any alternatives, including natural gas, nuclear, or any of the renewables. This chart simply shows there's a strong correlation between the percentage of coal generation in a state and the level of electricity rates in that state. In general, the more coal is used, the lower the electricity rates are. For example, in Texas here, where in excess of 1/3 of the electricity is generated using coal, rates are much lower than in other states that use a lot less coal, Florida, Maryland, Maine, Connecticut, and so forth. Electricity costs are important. They're like an unlegislated tax. As they go up, people have to pay more. As they go down, people actually pay less. Electricity price decreases acts like an economy-wide tax cut. On the demand side, people have more money to spend on other goods and services. On the supply side, it's cheaper for businesses to run their operations. Price matters. Rising electricity costs hurt industry and destroys jobs. What are some of the implications for Texas? Basically, as I mentioned, coal generates very cheap electricity. For other costs and benefits it might have, it's still by far the cheapest way of generating electricity. Lower electricity rates lead to increased disposable income, economic growth, and jobs. Thus, low-cost electricity generated by coal in the state of Texas produces a wide variety of economic and job benefits. Coal is essential to the U.S. economy, especially to the coal economy. Continued coal-fired electricity is essential to the economic future of Texas and coal generation. As you begin to phase it out, or try to phase it out for any reason, you're substituting more expensive costs of electricity generation. Is not good for the state economy. There's been a lot of talk about environmental regulations, too much, too little, too fast, too soon, what have you. People don't realize that over the past 3 decades, the amount of pollution caused by coal plants has decreased 80, 85, 90%, depending on the criteria of pollution you're looking at. Clean coal is not an oxymoron. Coal will never be entirely clean, but certainly has been a lot cleaner than it was 30 years ago, and is getting cleaner literally by the year. People, including our luncheon speaker, like to talk about ranking states and states in competition with each other. Here's a state, California, that generates very little electricity with coal. Its rates are and have been and continue to be much higher than those in Texas or average U.S. One of the things you look upon in California, not entirely, but to a large degree because of its insane energy and economic policies, you have a mass exodus of firms and jobs out of the state of California. And one of the major benefactors of that exodus is the state of Texas. Basically, there's an awful lot of companies and jobs moving from California to Texas for a whole variety of reasons. The energy and environmental environment in Texas is a major draw. Second theme I want to talk about for a few minutes this afternoon is the world liquid fuel situation, oil production in Texas, and how coal can actually help Texas increase its oil production, which doesn't sound intuitive, but you'll see in a minute. The problem with the world oil production, basically, is that you have existing oils depleting at the rate of 3 to 5% a year, which means every year you're losing 3 to 4 million barrels a day from existing mature wells. Conventional world oil production peaked in about 2005 within a small range. It hasn't increased at all, despite prices that were as high at one time as $150 a barrel and are now in excess of $100 a barrel. According to the EIA and IEA and many others, the world may have already reached its maximum level of conventional liquid fuel, conventional oil production. These are the latest IEA, International Energy Administration, forecasts of world liquid fuel production. It will continue to increase for the next 2 decades up to about 100 million barrels a day from the current about 86 or 87 million barrels a day. But all of that net increase, will have to come from unconventional liquid fuels production, unconventional oil, if you wish. And in fact, within 20 years, 1/3 of all the liquid fuels produced in the world will have to come from unconventional oil production. A large share of that will have to be CO2, carbon dioxide, enhanced oil recovery. Here's the situation in Texas. Onshore oil production in Texas peaked in 1972 at about 3.5 million barrels a day. It's been declining ever since. Currently, it's less than 1 million barrels a day, and 20% of that is CO2 EOR, carbon dioxide enhanced oil production. And the future of Texas oil production is with CO2 EOR. There's simply no other alternative. Producing oil via CO2 injection is quite simple. You pump CO2 into the mature well. This occurs after the, quote, easy oil has been gotten out, and the CO2 forces oil up. Estimates are you can increase the oil extracted from mature wells, existing oil in place, anywhere from 20 to 30, 40% of the original oil. Huge potential. CO2 EOR began in the U.S. in the 1970s, actually pioneered in Texas, where the U.S. and Texas are the leaders, both production and technology in the world. Interestingly, the key constraint at present to radically increasing the amount of oil produced via CO2 EOR is a constraint on CO2 supplies. There's not enough carbon dioxide available. It's primarily pumped from existing reservoirs in Colorado. At the present time, Texas produces 3 times more CO2 EOR than all other states combined. So Texas is a leader. Obviously, there's also infrastructure and pipelines that needs to be constructed. Here are some of the existing CO2 EOR infrastructure you'll see in the U.S. The potential, and there have been a series of studies over the past 2 decades looking at this, the potential of expanding or increasing U.S. oil production is well in excess of 100 billion barrels. It may be as high as 200 or 300 billion barrels, depending on the level of sophistication of the processes being used. Texas alone has been estimated has a potential for producing an additional 31 billion barrels of oil using CO2 EOR. This is just a map of the CO2 pipeline transport infrastructure in Permian Basin in Texas. Here's the key. The coal plants, as we all know, produce a fair amount of CO2. If that CO2 could be captured and piped to existing wells, that CO2 could facilitate oil production in a major way. There's a schematic, very simple. The CO2 is produced at the coal plant as a byproduct of electricity production. It's piped transported via pipeline, pumped into wells, perhaps in Texas, and forces the oil out. There are several demo plants already being constructed in Texas to do this. One is the Summit Texas Clean Energy IGCC project, first of a kind commercial clean coal power plant that is using CO2 generated for enhanced oil recovery. This is a futuristic diagram indicating the potential in the near term for vastly expanding CO2 EOR in the U.S. and particularly in Texas. The CO2 EOR opportunity in Texas is so large that it could absorb CO2 from all planned coal power plants and much, much more. So your CO2 disposal problem has just been solved. Importantly, and I'm near finishing here, CO2 EOR offers enormous potential economic benefits to Texas. If only 20% of the potential that I talked about, EOR, the Enhanced Oil Recovery, is produced, the benefits to the state are immense. $600 billion in wellhead value, $2 trillion in state gross product, 3 million jobs, $93 billion, upwards of $100 billion in taxes. So the economic potential for the state for the foreseeable future is immense. In conclusion, coal is critical to the Texas economy and jobs because it produces electricity at lowest rates possible. Low-cost energy is the engine for jobs and growth and prosperity. Future oil supplies in the world, and particularly in Texas, depend on increasing CO2 EOR. CO2 supplies are currently limited. If the CO2 produced by coal power plants could be captured and transported, that would solve the problem. The benefits in terms of economy, taxes, and tax revenues and jobs to Texas are immense. Thank you.
And Mr. Pendley.
Several weeks ago, Harold Hamm, the creator of Continental Resources, visited the White House. He had an opportunity to meet with the president, and he was asked what message did he want to say to the president. He told the Wall Street Journal afterwards that the message he wanted to convey was the remarkable technological advances the oil patch has made in the past several years. Because he thinks, Harold Hamm does, the president doesn't really understand what's going on in the oil patch and the remarkable change that's taken place and some of the things that have happened that you've already heard about and you've read about in the papers. And so he did. In his few minutes with the president, he said just that, and the president waved him off and said, Secretary Chu tells me that in 5 years, we'll have a battery that will run all our cars, and we won't need all that oil and gas. And Harold Hamm walked out of the meeting and said to the Wall Street Journal reporter, even if you believed that nonsense, why would you want to do away with all the jobs being created? Well, that tells you all you need to know about the president. And so the question on energy, Texas energy, boom or bust, boom or doom, American energy, boom or doom, is simply who's going to prevail in the current war of the Obama administration against American energy production, against American businesses, and against the right of Americans to own and use their property. I want to talk about 3 issues today. The first one is the Endangered Species Act, already alluded to. There's a big article on it. You've been reading about it, making the front page of all the newspapers. It's a serious issue. And it's been a burning since we created the Endangered Species Act in 1976, when it was supposed to address 100 species, only on federal land, and if it ever were to be found on private land, the private property would be purchased by the federal government. Just compensation would be provided. Well, now we've got hundreds of species on the list, even approaching thousands. It's on private property as well as federal lands, as we know here in Texas, and I've never known of a situation in which the federal government has paid a landowner for using his property for endangered species habitat. Instead, the federal government's attitude is, we're going to send people to jail. Hence, here in the West, or up in my part of the woods in Wyoming, Montana, we say shoot, shovel, and shut up. Environmentalists call the Endangered Species Act the pit bull of environmental laws, because unlike almost every other law you have, there is no cost-benefit analysis. As the Supreme Court said in the 1982 opinion of TVA versus Hill, not a single one of a species may go out of existence, quote, regardless of the cost, unquote. And in fact, that very phrase was used in a case we were in a few weeks ago, just last year, I guess, involving the Prevalence Meadow jumping mouse up in Wyoming, Colorado, in the Niobrara Basin, where we're trying to develop energy up there. And the judge rejected the evidence presented by the state of Wyoming about the economic impact of the designation of the species and said the Supreme Court ruling controls. A problem with the Endangered Species Act is there's no real science involved. Jack Ward Thomas famously said with regard to the northern spotted owl, there's no magic numbers of northern spotted owls. We're making moral judgments between the needs of people and the needs of owls. Well, you don't need a scientist for that. Maybe you need a priest or a rabbi or an imam, but you certainly don't need a scientist. And just a few weeks ago, and this article refers to it, just last week, the Obama administration settled a lawsuit. It's going to list hundreds of species here in Texas. We know about what's going on with the prairie chicken and the sage grouse. Not sage grouse, but the lizard. And in Wyoming and Montana, for example, we have 25 million acres of land possibly locked up as a result of a federal lawsuit over the sage grouse. I want to tell you also that Congress may not be able to cure this for us simply because when Congress said that a federal judge could not put an endangered species on the list, specifically the northern Rocky Mountain wolf, the environmental groups said it was unconstitutional for Congress to deny money to list a species under the Endangered Species Act. The second issue I want to talk about is the EPA. And the EPA is totally out of control. Absolutely no adult supervision in Washington, D.C. From coast to coast and border to border, in West Virginia, they're trying to kill a mine that was permitted by the Corps of Engineers. EPA is moving in and saying, no, we don't like that permit. We want to take it back. They're in federal court there. You know, last summer, the EPA rejected a plan by Shell Oil to develop a $4 billion project in the Gulf of Alaska simply because there were possibly air quality issues related to a village hundreds of miles away. Here in Texas, it's taken over the greenhouse gas program, and in North Dakota seized control of their air quality program up there in a dispute over how you determine if there's a violation. North Dakota wanted to do it on the basis of observable data, and EPA said, no, you have to do it on the basis of our model. And by the way, the guy who created the model says the model doesn't work. That's the situation we find ourselves in. EPA is adopting its own cap and trade. Congress rejected it, said, no, we're not going to do that. And EPA is adopting its own cap and trade. And now EPA wants to run the issue of fracking, control fracking. And by the way, if you've seen the reports of the EPA on the Pavilion well up there in Wyoming, that's been widely discredited. All the experts are looking at that saying it's nonsense, it has no basis in fact, and the EPA should step back and take another look at its data. I'm not surprised at all. For those of you who came in here to listen to this talk and had a hard time deciding whether you should have gone to the Obamacare talk, let me give you my Obamacare piece so you won't feel like you missed anything. The main issue in Obamacare is the issue of whether or not there's a role for sovereign states in this country, whether indeed we have a federal system where we recognize dual sovereignty. Remember what Nancy Pelosi said when someone said to her, a reporter, by the way, said, well, say, Speaker Pelosi, what do you say to those people who say it's unconstitutional? And her response was, you're kidding, right? She said it 3 times, you're kidding, right? Well, thousands and thousands of pages and hundreds of hours have gone in to deciding whether or not it is unconstitutional. I will tell you, a lot of smart lawyers and smart judges and justices don't think it's a frivolous question at all. Now, I'm optimistic, and I'll tell you why I'm optimistic, and that's because of a case called U.S. v. Bond. In the case of U.S. v. Bond, a woman was accused of murder, accused of attempted murder, and she sought to raise the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, saying the federal law with which I'm being charged should have been adopted by the state. And the federal prosecutor, the district court, and the Third Circuit Court of Appeals said, no, only a state may raise the issue of the 10th Amendment. And Justice Kennedy for the Supreme Court reversed and said, no, the 10th Amendment is not there to protect a state's rights. It's there to protect our liberties. So I'm optimistic on Obamacare. And the bottom line in talking about Obamacare in the oil and gas context is the EPA should not be regulated. It's certainly not under the Clean Water Act. That's an issue for states. States have been regulating it for years. And in fact, just last week, we had a breakthrough in Colorado where the governor and the energy community and the environmental community reached agreement on how to regulate fracking. The Justice Department is totally, almost missed that. The Justice Department also is totally out of control. You know about racial gerrymandering. Attorney General Eric Holder was here last week or the week before, gave some very inflammatory remarks. You know about the lawsuit by the Obama administration against Arizona for attempting to deal with the issue of illegal immigration. Well, it is not just the Civil Rights Division that's out of control. The whole Justice Department is out of control. We are in a case in Pennsylvania. Some of you have this litigator on your seats. A case in Pennsylvania where the Obama administration settled a lawsuit with the environmental community in an attempt to regulate privately owned oil and gas rights. We won that case, got an injunction in December of 2009. It was sustained by the Third Circuit in September of last year. And just last year, we had to go into the federal court and tell the judge, Judge, please hold the U.S. Forest Service in contempt of court because it's not obeying your order from 2009. Now, this is really just a remarkable set of affairs that the Justice Department is incapable of obeying the law and certainly a lawful order from a court. And this is the degree to which they are willing to go in preventing energy development. We've seen it here in the Gulf of Mexico, by the way. After the BP spill, after we got everything set up, the industry was ready to move forward, and the Obama administration continued to enforce a moratorium there. The judge told them to lift the moratorium. The Obama administration refused and was subsequently held in contempt of court for doing that. It's ironic to me that the Obama administration takes this kind of position when it has such a mentality with regard to the criminalization of activities. And I cite to you the Gibson guitar situation. If you don't know about it, Google for it. But we talked about it earlier in the criminal setting. I want to reference something that was said this morning by Dr. Bernstein, and that was his comment in answer to a question that was asked from the floor, and says, "I'm a small businessman. You're driving me nuts. You're driving me out of business with all these regulations." And Bernstein's response was, "You're not overregulated, you're just not doing enough business." Well, I'm going to tell you, we are overregulated, and the regulations that maybe a few years ago we could afford to pay for, we can't afford to pay for anymore. Regulations that don't make sense simply have to be done away with. It reminds me so much of Hillary Clinton's remark when she wanted to do Obamacare. Remember that? And some businessman said, "Oh, you're going to drive us out of business?" And she said, "Well, I can't be responsible for every undercapitalized entrepreneur." So that's the kind of mentality. One of the great things about the kind of debate we've heard this morning is those people really believe that nonsense. And sometimes that's refreshing. I want to tell you that what has happened as a result of the recession, as a result of these energy problems, for 25 years, Gallup has done a survey saying, what's more important? The energy? I'm doing it backwards. I'll do it for you. What's more important, the energy or the environment? And for 25 years, energy has been on top. In 2010, the economy line crossed over and is now rated above as more important than energy and than the environment. And there's a reason for it. People now understand what folks here in Texas know. I want to just close with a Ben Franklin quote. Governor Scott Walker, one of my heroes. I actually, when he got in trouble, when he started doing this thing against the unions, I sent an email up to Wisconsin and got a Scott Walker T-shirt. I'm the only one in Colorado with a Scott Walker T-shirt, but I'm proud of it. So I want to close with a Benjamin Franklin quote because he talked about Ben Franklin. After the Continental Congress, when Ben Franklin was walking out on the streets of Philadelphia, he was approached by an elderly woman, and she said, "Dr. Franklin, what kind of government have you given us, a republic or a monarchy?" And he replied, "A republic, if you can keep it." And we intend to keep it. Thank you.